The Honourable Member for Brampton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start off with simply summarizing what this bill is trying to accomplish. If you look at subsection 2, it simply says every person who contravenes subsection 1, the previous section, is guilty of an indictable offence and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 10 years less a day. And then it simply says that any person shall possess, no person shall possess, produce, sell, or import anything knowing it will be used to produce or traffic in a substance referred to when we have the schedules there. Mr. Speaker, we support that going to committee. We have no problem with that in terms of studying it. I have some preliminary concerns, which is we want to make sure, obviously, that people are aware of if they will be violating the law. If you look at section 7.1, possess, produce, sell, or import anything knowing that it will be used to produce, there will have to be a lot of detail put in that, presumably in the regulations, but it's something that's going to have to be worked out and studied in some detail. But Mr. Speaker, my main point today, once again we're supporting it going to committee, but my main point today is why now, and why in this particular context. These recommendations that are in this legislation actually emanated from a Justice Canada report from 2007. That's fine. Why, if this is so important at this time today, why is this not in a government bill? This government has had no difficulty pursuing a law and order agenda, and I'd like to go through that and why they've done that. We've had the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The response of the Conservative government, law and order legislation. We've had the loss of approximately 500,000 full-time jobs. The response of the government, law and order legislation. We've had an isotopes crisis, so Canadians can't get the testing that they require for cancer treatments. The response from the government, law and order legislation. We've had the reduction of Canada's place inside the G8 from the best GDP to the worst. The response of the Conservative government, law and order legislation. We've had an EI crisis. The response was legislation that divides Canadians between the good workers and the bad workers, being the long-term workers and the short-term workers, and nothing for seasonal workers. And then the further response of the government, law and order legislation. We have an H1N1 pandemic crisis. We have a failure of this government to have a national pandemic plan in place, as confirmed by Canada's Auditor General. The response of this government, law and order legislation. An Afghanistan torture scandal. The response of this government, law and order legislation. So why? Why do we keep going to law and order legislation? And I want to be clear, I support this member's efforts in terms of this particular piece of legislation. But this is one that should have been far up on this law and order agenda. Why did it take a private member to introduce this? Why wasn't this already introduced and passed earlier? It should have been. Because we do have serious problems in Canada. We have, in terms of these particular drugs, we have high emergency room rates, deaths, permanent alteration of brains of humans, psychiatric disorders. We have statistics in terms of an American study where for 8th graders, 2.3% of all 8th graders, and I find this shocking, had tried these drugs, 2.4% of 10th graders, and 2.8% of 12th graders. So there must be something similar in Canada, although we don't have those studies. So once again, I support this legislation, but if it had been government legislation, rather than a private member's bill, more could have been done. Where is the money for prevention? Where is the money for education? And so that everybody understands, when it comes to private members' legislation, and I'm not criticizing my friend who introduced this, but he's not allowed to put provisions in a private member's bill that involve the spending of money. So it's not his fault. But if the government had introduced this legislation, there could have been spending on these issues. Crime prevention, drug education, education in schools for children, treatment programs, all of that for the sufferers that take these drugs and for the prevention to try to avoid this. So my friend's bill would have been far superior, once again, no fault of his own, if this had been government legislation, but it's not. Now, in Canada, I have the honor of serving on Canada's Public Safety and National Security Committee, so I'm aware of some of these statistics. 80% of the criminals who are incarcerated in our prisons have either substance abuse or mental health issues. That means that a huge majority of people who commit crimes and eventually get incarcerated first had these problems. So what is the government doing to prevent that, to stop the people, to try to help them and cure them before they actually commit crimes? If this had been government legislation, they could have done something, but it's not. As well, in terms of prisons and treatment in prisons, we have clear admissions from various experts who have appeared that people have to understand most prisoners get released into society. So if they've come into prison because of mental health or addiction issues, logically, we would want to make sure they got the treatment required before they were released. It would have been quite nice if this was government legislation doing something about that, because the experts have admitted that people in prison are not getting the treatment that they require before they're being released. That is a public safety issue, and frankly, in order to protect the Canadian populace, you would want those people to be released better than when they came in. Now, the other issue, in terms of drugs, since that's the topic we're discussing, with respect to prisons, there are clear admissions that the prison population is getting these illegal drugs into prison. What is the government doing to prevent these drugs from seeping into our prisons? They should be doing something. This legislation could be part of a larger package if it was a government bill trying to effectuate such changes both in society and in the prison population. Nothing. Once again, not the fault of my friend, because he's not allowed to introduce that because this is only a private member's bill. In terms of what the government has done in further law and order agenda, look at some of the other examples for what they've put ahead of this. The sex offender registry, which I support. I support this legislation, but it was introduced weak. It came in before Parliament without the benefit of the report of our committee. And then it had clear things that were omitted that should have been included based on all the experts. For example, mandatory license plate registrations of convicted sex offenders. The government and the Minister Van Loan specifically said he chose not to include that in the legislation, despite the fact that all the experts recommended it, and it's logical. So even when they are pursuing the law and order agenda, they're not doing it properly. Other pieces of legislation, we have the faint hope clause. Nobody, in terms of experts, was clamoring for any changes on that. Conditional sentences, same thing. 2 for 1, time served, mandatory minimums. None of this was a societal problem like drugs, to the same comparison. This is certainly a greater problem. Yet there was no, the government chose not to do anything with respect to these drugs on the street, and they left it to a conservative private member to introduce this legislation, and he's not allowed to make any suggestions to actually put money onto the streets, reforms, or help in any measurable way. That's a mistake. This legislation should have been, based on the 2007 recommendations from the Justice Canada report, at the front of the line, or close to the front of the line for this law and order agenda. It wasn't. That was a mistake. So, in essence, I say I only have 1 minute left, so I will say this. I compliment my friend for bringing this private member's bill forward. I support it. It should go to committee, but I question why this government has pursued, in response to all the problems Canadians are facing, a law and order agenda, and then not even putting the most serious law and order issue, such as drugs on our street in this context, at the front of the line or close to the front of the line in order to help Canadians. They've ignored that. It's a mistake, and I compliment my friend for fixing the government's problem, or at least trying to. Thank you.
Reprise de